My mother found out she couldn't retire 3 days before her 65th birthday, and the person who broke her heart wasn't a stranger, a scammer, or bad luck. It was her own son. That's not even the worst part. The worst part is what he said to me when I was the one who told her. My name is Rachel, and for most of my life, I was the daughter who did everything right and got noticed for none of it, while my younger brother Tyler did everything wrong and somehow always landed on his feet, cushioned by our parents' forgiveness like it was a trampoline built just for him. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I used to. Now I just say it because it's true, and because understanding it is the only way this story makes any sense. Our parents, Linda and Frank, spent 38 years building a modest but steady life. Frank worked as a mechanic, ran his own small shop for the last 15 of those years. Linda taught 3rd grade. Neither of them made huge money, but they were careful, the kind of careful that meant packed lunches instead of takeout, a 15-year-old car instead of a new one, vacations that were road trips to visit family instead of flights to anywhere warm. They weren't cheap. They were disciplined. There's a difference, and growing up, I didn't fully understand it until I watched what discipline actually built over 4 decades. By the time Dad turned 62, they had almost $400,000 saved between his retirement accounts, a small pension from the shop's eventual sale, and a modest inheritance from my grandmother. It wasn't a fortune. But it was enough to retire comfortably, enough to travel a little, enough to not spend their final years worrying about money the way they'd spent every year before that. Tyler was 31 years old, living in an apartment he could barely afford, cycling through jobs the way some people cycle through gym memberships, enthusiastic for 2 months, then quietly gone. He'd tried sales, he'd tried a food truck that lasted 1 summer, he'd tried consulting, a word he used with a straight face that always made me want to ask consulting on what, exactly, but I never did, because every time I asked Tyler a direct question, my mother would give me a look that meant don't start. I didn't start. For years, I didn't start anything. I built my own career quietly, in accounting of all things, married my husband Marcus, bought a modest house, had 2 kids, and mostly stayed out of Tyler's orbit because staying out of it was easier than watching my parents bail him out again and paying the emotional cost of pointing it out. Then, 18 months ago, Tyler came to our parents with an idea. He called it an opportunity. He called it, and I remember this phrase exactly because he used it at every family dinner for months afterward, the kind of thing that only comes around once. It was a cryptocurrency trading platform run by a friend of a friend, promising returns that, looking back, should have set off alarms audible from space. 12% monthly. Not annually. Monthly. Tyler had already put in some of his own savings, what little he had, and wanted our parents to invest alongside him, to get in before it's too big to get good returns. I wasn't at that dinner. I heard about it a week later, from my mother, on the phone, her voice light and hopeful in a way that made my stomach drop before she'd even finished the sentence. Tyler found this wonderful opportunity, she said. He's been very responsible about it, Rachel. He's really done his research. Your father and I are thinking of putting in a little, just to help him get started, and to see some growth ourselves before we retire. How much is a little? I asked. There was a pause. We haven't decided yet. I should have pushed harder in that moment. I've replayed that phone call more times than I can count, wondering what would have happened if I had asked more questions, demanded more details, driven the 4 hours to sit at their kitchen table and look at whatever documents Tyler was waving around. But my mother has always had a particular tone she uses when she doesn't want to be questioned. A bright, closed-door cheerfulness, and I recognized it, and I let it close the door. I found out 4 months later, almost by accident, how much a little had actually meant. I was helping my parents with their taxes, something I'd done every year since I got my CPA license, a small way of being useful that had nothing to do with Tyler and everything to do with genuinely loving them. I was going through their investment statements, expecting the usual modest, steady numbers I'd seen every year of my adult life. Instead, I found a withdrawal from my father's rollover IRA. $90,000. Then another, from a joint brokerage account. $65,000. Then a third, smaller one, from what used to be my grandmother's inheritance fund. $22,000. $177,000. Gone from accounts that were supposed to carry my parents through the next 20 years of their lives, transferred, according to the memo lines, to something called Halcyon Digital Growth Partners. I sat at their kitchen table with my laptop open and felt something in my chest go cold and very still, the way it does right before you understand something you desperately don't want to understand. Mom, I called into the living room, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. Can you come look at something with me? She came in still holding her coffee mug, still smiling, still completely unaware that her entire retirement was about to unravel in her own kitchen. I turned the laptop toward her and pointed at the transfers. "What is this?" I asked. "Halcyon Digital Growth Partners. What is this account?" The color left her face slowly, the way it does when someone is trying very hard not to panic in front of their child. That's Tyler's investment. The one he told us about. We put some money in. Mom, this is $177,000. She sat down. She didn't say anything for almost a full minute, and in that silence I watched her doing the math in her head, watching decades of careful discipline collapse into a single number she hadn't let herself fully add up until right now, out loud, in front of her daughter. "Tyler said it was performing well," she finally said, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "He showed us statements. Growth every month. He said your father and I would be able to retire early, that this would set us up for the rest of our lives. Mom, where's the money now? Can we log into the account?" She didn't know the login. Tyler had set everything up. Tyler managed the account. Tyler had told them not to worry about the details, that he was handling everything, that this was his way of finally giving back after everything they'd done for him. I called him that afternoon, my hands shaking in a way I hadn't expected, my voice tighter than I intended. "Tyler, I need you to explain the Halcyon account to me. Right now." There was a pause on the line, just slightly too long to be innocent. "Why are you going through Mom and Dad's finances? That's not really your business, Rachel. I do their taxes." It became my business the moment I saw $177,000 missing from accounts that are supposed to fund their retirement. "Where is the money?" Another pause. Then, in a tone that I can only describe as performed calm, the kind of voice people use when they've rehearsed a lie so many times it started to feel like the truth to them, "The platform's been having some liquidity issues. It's temporary. A lot of platforms are going through this right now. It's a market thing, it's not permanent." "Liquidity issues," I repeated. "You wouldn't understand the technical side of it," he said, and something in that sentence, the casual condescension of it, delivered while our parents' life savings sat frozen or vanished in some account he barely understood himself, made the cold feeling in my chest turn into something sharper. "Try me," I said. He didn't try me. He gave me vague phrases instead: smart contracts, staking periods, a temporary freeze while the platform resolves some back-end issues, the kind of language that sounds technical enough to shut down questions from people who don't know better. And completely falls apart the moment someone who does know better starts asking follow-up questions. I spent the next 6 hours doing what I should have done 18 months earlier. I researched Halcyon Digital Growth Partners. It took less than 20 minutes to find the first red flag. The company had been registered only 14 months prior, in a state with minimal disclosure requirements, listing a single officer whose name didn't match any professional background I could find. It took another 20 minutes to find 3 separate online forums where people described almost identical experiences, promising returns for the first several months, encouragement to invest more, and then, right around the time larger amounts had been committed, the liquidity issue excuse, followed by silence, followed by nothing at all. It was a Ponzi scheme. Not an unlucky investment, not a market downturn, not bad timing. An actual, textbook Ponzi structure, the kind that pays early investors with money from later investors until the recruitment can't outpace the payouts anymore, and then it simply collapses, taking everyone's money with it. Tyler hadn't just invested our parents' money in something risky. He had put $177,000 of their retirement into what appeared to be, by every indicator I could find, an outright fraud, either because he'd been catastrophically naive, or because some part of him had known and gambled anyway, hoping the returns would come in before anyone noticed the risk. I drove to my parents' house that evening instead of calling. Some conversations shouldn't happen over the phone. My father was in his recliner when I got there, and I watched my mother's face when I walked in, already knowing from my expression that I hadn't found good news. I sat them both down at the kitchen table, the same table I'd found the transfers on that morning, and I told them everything: the registration date, the forum posts, the pattern that matched fraud reports almost exactly, the fact that the liquidity issue Tyler described wasn't a real financial term for what was actually happening to their money. My father, a man who had fixed cars with his own 2 hands for 40 years, who had never once in my entire life raised his voice at anyone in our family, sat very still and very quiet for a long time. Then he asked one question. "Is it gone? All of it?" I didn't have a complete answer yet. I told him I'd spent the day researching, not filing reports, not contacting a lawyer, not yet chasing down every possible avenue of recovery. But based on everything I'd found, the honest answer, the one he deserved even though it would break something in him to hear it, was that recovery was unlikely, and even if some fraction came back through eventual legal proceedings, it would take years, and it would almost certainly not be the full amount. My mother didn't cry right away. She just sat there, staring at a spot on the table, and said, very quietly, "I taught third grade for 31 years so we could have this. So we wouldn't have to worry." 3 days later was her 65th birthday. She had planned to formally give her retirement notice to the school district that week, the culmination of decades of careful discipline finally paying off into the freedom she'd earned. Instead, she called the district office and told them she'd need to keep working, at least for now, at least until they figured out what was actually left. I want to tell you that Tyler apologized in that moment, that seeing our parents' faces made him understand the weight of what he'd done. He didn't. When I called him that night to tell him what I'd found and what it meant for Mom's retirement, his first response wasn't guilt. It was defensiveness. "You didn't have to go digging through everything and making it a bigger deal than it needed to be," he said. "I was handling it." "You weren't handling it, Tyler. You lost $177,000 of their retirement in a scam, and you let them keep thinking it was temporary while Mom planned to retire in 3 days. It's not definitely a scam, you don't know that for sure. I found 4 other people online describing the exact same thing happening to them. At the exact same stage, with the exact same excuses. It's a scam, Tyler." The silence on the line stretched long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Then he said something I don't think I'll ever fully stop hearing when I close my eyes. "Well, if I hadn't shown them the opportunity, you would have just let them retire on almost nothing anyway. At least I tried to get them more." I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up. At least I tried. As if trying with someone else's life savings, without their full understanding of the risk, without transparency about how much had actually gone in, was some kind of generosity instead of what it actually was, a gamble made with money that wasn't his to gamble, followed by months of vague reassurances designed to buy time rather than tell the truth. The weeks after that were some of the hardest our family has ever gone through, and not in the loud, dramatic way you might expect. There was no screaming match at a family dinner, no dishes thrown, no one storming out of a room. It was quieter than that, and somehow heavier for being quiet. My mother stopped calling Tyler as often. Not out of some dramatic decision to cut him off, but because every time she picked up the phone to call her son, she'd remember, freshly, that the voice on the other end belonged to the person who had taken away the retirement she'd spent 38 years earning. She told me once, on the phone, her voice flat in a way I'd never heard from her before, "I don't know how to talk to him right now without thinking about it. I keep trying to just be his mother, and then I remember, and I can't." My father, who I mentioned rarely raised his voice, did something instead that surprised me more than yelling would have. He went quiet. Really quiet. For the first month, he barely spoke about it at all, and when Tyler called the house, my father would hand the phone to my mother almost immediately, finding some sudden urgent task in another room. It wasn't rage. It was something closer to grief, the particular grief of realizing that a decision he'd trusted his son to make responsibly had instead cost him the ending he'd planned for his working life. I hired a lawyer, a woman named Denise who specialized in financial fraud recovery, mostly working with elderly victims of exactly this kind of scheme. She was blunt from our first conversation, which I appreciated even as it was hard to hear. Realistically, she told me, reviewing the documents I'd gathered, recovery on cases like this ranges from partial to nothing at all, depending on how quickly the operators move the funds and whether any assets remain seizable. "I'll do everything I can, but I want you to go into this with accurate expectations, not hope you'll be disappointed by." It took 4 months of investigation, filings, and a joint effort with law enforcement who were, it turned out, already tracking Halcyon Digital Growth Partners as part of a larger fraud investigation involving several other victims across 3 states. In the end, my parents recovered about $31,000 of the original $177 funds seized from one of the operator's remaining accounts before it could be fully drained, distributed proportionally among the victims who had filed claims in time. $31,000 out of 177. My mother did the math out loud once, sitting at that same kitchen table, and said, in a tone somewhere between disbelief and exhaustion, "That's not even 1 year of what I would have needed." Here's the part of this story that I think surprises people the most when I tell it, the part that doesn't fit the tidy narrative where the reckless sibling finally faces consequences and everyone moves toward some clean resolution. Tyler never really faced consequences, not in the way you'd expect. My parents didn't sue him. You can't really sue your own son for a decision he genuinely, if recklessly, believed would help them, and the money he'd invested was already gone regardless of what any lawsuit might have produced. There was no dramatic family intervention where everyone sat him down and made him understand the gravity of what he'd done. He understood it, eventually, in his own way, but not through some cinematic moment of accountability. It happened slowly, through the accumulating weight of two parents who loved him but no longer fully trusted him, through holidays that got quieter, through phone calls that got shorter, through the particular loneliness of realizing that the people who raised you are being careful around you now in a way they never were before. I want to be honest about my own part in this too, because it would be easy to tell this story as though I did everything right and Tyler did everything wrong, and while that's mostly true about this specific situation, it's not the whole truth about our family. 4 years before this happened, I let my parents make excuses for Tyler because it was easier than confronting the pattern directly. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility to manage my brother's choices, and in the strictest sense, that was true. I'm not responsible for decisions Tyler makes as an adult. But there's a difference between not being responsible for someone's choices and staying silent while those choices quietly accumulate risk around people you love. I had years of small opportunities to ask harder questions, to push past my mother's bright, closed-door cheerfulness, to insist on seeing documents before large sums of money moved anywhere. I didn't, mostly because keeping the peace felt easier than being the difficult daughter who was always suspicious of her brother. I don't carry guilt about the scam itself. That responsibility sits entirely with Tyler, and with the people who built Halcyon Digital Growth Partners to prey on exactly the kind of trusting optimism my parents brought into that decision. But I do think about the 18 months before I found those transfers, and I wonder how different things might have looked if I'd asked one more question at that very first dinner I wasn't even at, the one where Tyler first pitched the opportunity that only comes around once. My mother is 67 now. She's still teaching, 2 years past when she'd planned to retire, in a classroom of 8-year-olds who have no idea that their teacher's retirement was quietly stolen by her own son's recklessness. She tells me some days it's fine, that she still loves the work, that maybe this just means she gets a few more years doing something she's good at. Other days, when she doesn't think I'm really listening, she says something smaller and sadder that she notices, now, every time a coworker her age retires and talks about their first year of freedom, and she has to smile and be happy for them while doing math in her head about how many more years she has left before she can join them. My father retired anyway, a year later than planned, on a reduced version of the life they'd built together, smaller trips, a tighter monthly budget, careful math around a future that used to feel settled and now requires constant, quiet recalculation. He doesn't talk about Halcyon Digital Growth Partners much. When he does, it's brief, almost clinical, like he's describing something that happened to someone else's retirement instead of his own. Tyler and I don't talk the way we used to, which honestly, if I'm being fully honest, might not be entirely a loss. Our relationship before this was never as close as it looked from the outside. I was always managing some quiet resentment about the different standards we'd been held to, and he was always, I think now, a little aware of that resentment without ever fully acknowledging it. What happened with the investment didn't create the distance between us. It just removed the reason we'd both been pretending it wasn't there. He's working again, a stable job this time, the kind with a regular paycheck and no talk of opportunities that only come around once. I hope that's real growth and not just circumstance. I genuinely don't know which it is yet, and I've stopped trying to predict it. The last time I saw him, at a birthday dinner for my daughter, he pulled me aside in the kitchen while everyone else was in the other room, and for the first time since that phone call 18 months earlier, he said something close to an actual apology. I think about it a lot, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. What Mom said about teaching 31 years for this. I think about that a lot. I told him that was good. I told him thinking about it mattered, but that thinking about it wasn't the same as the years Mom had to keep working, or the trips she and Dad won't take now, or the particular kind of trust that doesn't fully come back once it's been broken like that. He nodded. He didn't argue with me, which itself felt like a small kind of progress. I don't know how this story ends, honestly, in the way stories are supposed to end, with some clean lesson wrapped around the pain to make it feel like it was worth something. My parents are managing. My mother will retire eventually, a few years later than she should have had to, having earned it twice over by then. My father has made peace with a smaller version of the future he'd planned, in the quiet, practical way he's made peace with every hard thing in his life. Tyler is, I hope, becoming someone more careful with the people who trust him, though trust, once spent this completely, doesn't rebuild on the same timeline it took to break. What I keep coming back to, more than the money, more than the scam itself, is that single sentence Tyler said to me on the phone the night I found out. At least I tried to get them more. I understand now that he meant it as a defense. But it sounds, to me, like the truest confession he ever gave, an admission that somewhere in his mind, wanting more had quietly outweighed the responsibility of protecting what they already had. My mother taught 3rd grade for 31 years to build a retirement she trusted her own son with, and it took him less than 2 years to lose almost half of it chasing returns that never should have sounded believable in the first place. She's teaching year 33 now, in the same classroom, with the same careful discipline she's always had, doing the math on her future all over again, one paycheck at a time. If you've ever had a family member gamble with money that wasn't fully theirs to risk, an inheritance, a retirement fund, a sure thing that turned out to be anything, but I want to hear how your family handled it, because I still don't fully know if we handled ours right. Some wounds, I'm learning, don't close. They just get managed, quietly, for the rest of everyone's life.